think I just realized a kind of different ways of thinking when it comes to Chinese people, say, and Westerners in general. Um, I had this kind of epiphany because not too long ago, a friend of mine who's a Christian and Australian Chinese told me about his experience, visiting Chinese temples. He's a Christian, so he, of course, wouldn't believe in things like Buddha. But the way he described his kind of experience in the temples kind of interested me because he said the experience was suffocating because there's a kind of nothingness and meaninglessness to the vibe of of Buddhism in general to him. And to me, that's interesting because he's a Christian, and he told me many times that one of the reasons, primarily so, that he believed in Christianity because he wanted to find a way to fit in. And Christianity seems to be the kind of religion that emphasizes compassion, love, forgiveness, and acceptance no matter what. So, yeah, I think no power to you, as long as people can find solace, comfort, love in their own way, in their own faith, you know, I should be all up for it. Why not? But the thing is that there's something quite tricky about this friend because she's also someone who's an evangelical Christian. And that means that he wanted more people to know about his belief, Jesus, and to, in his understanding, to make more people be saved in the final judgment. So there's one time he actually asked me this question: do you now believe that Jesus really died for you and for your sin, and you thereby put your trust in him? Well, if you're just a random pastor who just want to score point on me, um, my answer would be quite easy. Fuck off. You don't want to just proselytize me to at something that you can show off in the church. But the thing is that he's my friend, and we have a very robust friendship. The reason he asked me this question is exactly because he wanted me to be saved in the quote unquote judgment. So that's the tricky part. I think I answered that question with honesty. I said, I don't believe that he's my savior, and I don't see a reason to believe so, especially when there's no evidence for it. So um, I said so, and I think to further that kind of logic, I would say the world of religion or the world of faith, that kind of spiritual world, is a logically consistent world on itself. So you can't say that there's anything wrong within this world. You can't find a logical flow. Maybe you can, but generally speaking, you can't. And but somehow it's not the material world that we now live in. And the only kind of connection between the world we live in and the spiritual world is our faith. So it's in its essence unfalsifiable. That's why it's called a religion, not history. Um, and I think faith is something that's kind of having an instrumental purpose. People having different faith because it serves them to a degree. People are depressed, people are anxious, people don't find their life, sufferable anymore. People have suicidal thoughts. They all need some kind of spiritual solace and help. Some people go to a psychologist, some people, you know, find more friends to talk to. Some people would go to religion. Not all people are converting to a religion because of that reason. Let's be clear, but some of them do. So I think, people should have their right to do that. But at the same time, I was thinking about why, you know, some Westerners, they can't accept the fact that, accept the assumption that life could be meaningless in its final analysis. Because we are also talking to a friend of ours a few days ago about Buddhism, and she is a Vietnamese and she's a Buddhist. So there's a quite interesting kind of description of hers when it comes to Buddhism. Although Buddhism is kind of like a blanket term because there's so many different ways of contextualizing Buddhism, but in her understanding, Buddhism is something like asking everybody to find their own Buddha in their own heart. So it's like saying, you know, the God is not an exact kind of thing, but it's something that ought to be found on your own. And also, the kind of Christian idea of heaven is also different in the Buddhist world. The heaven or the paradise of each individual is solely dependent. It's very dependent on what you think to be important and meaningful in your life. So, as we said, one man's meat is it might be another man's poison. And in the same way, we could argue that to each individual, happiness, meaning, these kind of things can only be found in their own ways. And I would say, as a Chinese who might have a propensity to more kind of pragmatic way of thinking, I would say there's no meaning to life essentially. You know, if you look at the suffering of our people in history and the suffering of our land, it's very hard to make a case there is an all-loving, all-powerful God that allows and permits all these things to happen. I just can't accept that as a fact. So I would say life is meaningless, but I can also see, quite fortunately so, the kind of resilience and optimism of my people. And I think I should give the credit to themselves. These people, the people I grew up with, they might have some kind of extraordinary hardship in their lives, but they didn't say, I will surrender, I will give up. I think that's their merit because they are trying to bootstrap their way to find their own meaning in their lives. And they are their own gods. And some of them, if they are good enough, they will also pass on that kind of goodness to other people. But we all are flawed, you know, so we can't be perfect in doing so. But I think that's my understanding of how to think about the question of meaning now. It's to be found on our own. And we can, of course, resort this question to a all powerful, all knowing God, but at the end of the day, it's up to us.